to introduce the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation Toronto, Ms. Noriko Yamamoto.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noriko Yamamoto, and I'm Executive Director of the Japan Foundation Toronto. Thank you all for being here today with us as we welcome author HIRANO Keiichiro to Seattle. Mr. Hirano is our esteemed guest speaker for the North American Japanese Literary Forum, which is a two-stop speaking tour in Canada and the US to deepen interest in Japanese literature overseas. Known for his exceptional literary themes and captivating portrayals of complex human interactions, Mr. Hirano's insights on current trend in Japanese literature are sure to be enlightening. We are immensely grateful for his participation. I would also like to thank the Consul General of Japan in Seattle, Mr. Makoto Iori, who cannot attend today's event due to a previous commitment, and his associates for their assistance in promoting today's event, as well as Ms. Hiroko Ishii Cassidy for providing English-Japanese interpretation for the Q&A session to follow. To welcome Mr. Hirano, we have in the audience several Japan Foundation representatives. Let me introduce the Vice President, Executive Vice President, Dr. Yuri Sato, Japan Foundation New York Office, Director General Masayoshi Moyama, and Japan Foundation Los Angeles Office, Director Yasuko Uchida. Today's event has been the collaborative planning between all the three US and Canada offices, as well as headquarters in Tokyo. And we are all delighted to see everyone in attendance today to celebrate Mr. Hirano and the growing worldwide influence of the Japanese literature. Lastly, this forum would not have been possible without the support of the Japan P.E.N Club, and I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Japan P.E.N and its representative, Professor Ayako Sato, for their invaluable contributions which helped make this event possible. So now, please welcome Professor Sato to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to North American Japanese Literary Forum, questioning what am I? Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Ayako Sato, the moderator of today's forum and Executive Director of Japan P.E.N Club. Thank you. Now, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Ms. Noriko Yamamoto, the Japan Foundation Toronto, and Mr. Masaya Shinoyama, the Japan Foundation New York, Ms. Yasuko Uchida, the Japan Foundation Los Angeles, and the Consul General of Seattle. And I would like also express my deepest gratitude to all the people who have worked to make literary forum possible. I would like to introduce Mr. Keiichiro Hirano, distinguished Japanese writer, who is today's speaker. Mr. Hirano debuted in 1999 with his first novel, The Eclipse, for which he won the prestigious Akutagawa Prize at the age of 23. And he has received many other literary awards since then. His style varies with every work, which all incorporate profound themes like self-love, relationships, and acceptance. His works spanning short stories, historical novels, essays, and love stories have been translated and widely read in France, China, Korea, Taiwan, Italy, and Egypt. He is also known for his deep knowledge of art and music and received order from the French government in 2014. In 2004, Mr. Hirano spent his days in Paris as a cultural conveyor of the Agency for Cultural Affairs. His novel, A Man, was published in 2020 in North America. This was Mr. Hirano's first novel to be translated into English. His second, At the End of Matinee, was published in 2021. This novel was a runaway bestseller in Japan and was made into film in 2022. In 2023, he published his theory on Mishima Yukio, which received the Hideo Kobayashi Award. It is often said that Mr. Hirano is the second coming of the Yukio Mishima. To conclude this brief introduction, let me introduce the Japan Pen Club, which is the co-organizer of this forum. Mr. Hirano and I am both members of Japan Pen Club. The Japan Pen Club is one of the centers of the International Pen in London, which was founded in 1922. The Pen International has more than 100 centers. The Japan Pen Club is a Pen International Center and was founded in 1930. Currently, the Japan Pen Club was over 1,300 members. The first president of Japan Pen Club was Toson Shimazaki, a fiction writer and poet active in the Meiji, Taisho, and early Showa period. Yasuyuki Kawabata and Kenzo Oe, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, were also president of the Japan Pen Club. The Japan Pen Club has 14 committees, and each of them is active. In particular, the Committee of Women Writers, Freedom of Speech and Expression, Writers in Prison, Children's Books, and Writers of Peace are very engaged. Mr. Hirano is the head of international committees, to which I also belong. In order to get readers around the world interested in Japanese literature, it is very important to plan literary forums such as Trades Overseas, as well as to translate works and developing translators. Last year, the Japan Pen Club held a symposium entitled Another Home Country. The speakers were non-native writers of Japan living in Japan. The situation surrounding Japanese literature is changing as it diversities, and what comprises Japanese literature is becoming more and more interesting. The Japan Pen Club hopes to continue to hold literary forums like this in many different countries to introduce the latest Japanese literature. Now, please welcome Mr. Hirano and enjoy his talk. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keiichiro Hirano. It's a great honor to be invited to the North American Japanese Literary Forum and to speak to such a wonderful audience. I've been looking forward to meeting all of you. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all those who have contributed to this lecture, especially Ms. Yamamoto, the director of Japan Foundation, Toronto, the staff of the Japan Foundation, New York and Los Angeles, and the Consulate General of Japan in Seattle, and the interpreters. Thank you very much. Today's speech will be given in English, but my English, I'm not very good at English, so I have prepared a manuscript, and there will be a time for question and answer later. So I would be grateful if you could give your comments and questions at that time. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, the subject of this lecture is an introduction to contemporary Japanese literature. But from the standpoint of a single author, it is difficult to give a comprehensive account of the literature of our time, which is so diverse. As a novelist, I'm not good at talking about categories. Novels always start with someone who has a proper name, who lives in a house somewhere, and who has concrete relationships. It is impossible to write a novel in which the subject is Japanese, or woman, or Japanese literature. And that's why the novel is good to have a protagonist who isn't ordinary at all, but a special, exceptional person. As a division of academic genres, the idea is to distinguish between idiographic discipline, which is a discipline that assumes the uniqueness of a social phenomena, and normothetic discipline, which is a discipline that pursues scientific laws. In fields such as psychology and geography, a similar distinction exists in terms of approach, individual descriptive approach or law-oriented approach. Novels are, in principle, individual descriptive, but at the end of reading a single work, readers often have law-oriented impressions about the Japanese or women, or about people in 19th century, etc. It could be said that individual concrete examples open up and lead to a kind of universality. Therefore, today I'd like to present my own journey as a writer as a concrete example, so to speak, in an individual descriptive style, rather than starting my talk on Japanese literature or Japanese novelists from a category. In particular, by explaining the characteristics of the lost generation, lost gene, to which I belong, and how this generation differs from the generations before and after it. As a result, I'm not sure that a law-oriented conclusion about Japanese writers can be drawn. Rather, I hope that it will lead to a free consideration of the differences and the similarities with readers around the world. The keyword is identity, or as the title of the lecture says, what am I, is the question. Well, I was born in 1975 and belong to the Dankai Junior Sedai, junior baby boomer generation in Japan. The generation of children of the first post-war baby boomer generation, known as the Dankai no Sedai. There is some variation in the definition of this generation, which strictly refers to those born between 1971 and 1974, and the years 75 to 81 are often defined as post-Dankai Junior, post-baby boomers, but there is no clear demarcation between them in terms of generational experience. So here, I will roughly refer to the generation from the early to late 1970s as the Dankai Junior Sedai, junior baby boomer generation. In fact, this generation almost overlaps with the so-called lost generation, lost gene. I grew up in Kitakyushu City, Fukuoka Prefecture, in the southern part of Japan. My hometown was a heavy and chemical industry city. Japan's heavy industry began here with the establishment of the Yahata Steel Works, 1901, as reparations for the Sino-Japanese War, but during my childhood in the 1980s, the city experienced a decline. I was actually not much of a reader while I was in elementary school. It doesn't mean that I didn't like books, but rather that there were so many other more enjoyable things to do. And on nice days, I was so busy outside playing baseball and soccer and catching insects that I couldn't really sit still in the house. When the Nintendo video games came out, I was hooked on them for a while. I was just an ordinary boy in a rural town in Japan in the 80s. The only thing that made me different from the other children was that I lost my father when I was an infant. My parents began their married life in Aichi Prefecture, where my father's family lived. Aichi Prefecture is geographically in the middle of Japan. We were a happy family, but at the age of 36, my father's heart suddenly stopped and he passed away. I was only 1 year old at that time, so I have no memory of my father. I am now 48 years old, which means I'm 12 years older than my father. It's a very strange feeling. After my father passed away, my mother took me and my sister, who was 8 years older than me, back to her parents' house in Kitakyushu. I was 2 years old. My father's death has several important implications for me as a novelist. The first is that I'm sure my father took good care of me, but I just can't recall it. This is natural given my age, and so memory and forgetting became a major theme in my writing. I knew my father, of course, through his photographs, including his portrait. For me, my father's photos were as important as he was. The number of my father's photos was limited. They were one of the few precious pieces of evidence I had of my father. This feeling motivates my strong interest in media theory. My most recent novel, Heart of Hearts, unfortunately not yet translated into English, tells the story of a young man who grew up in a single mother household and lost his mother, and who uses AI to create a virtual figure of his mother in cyberspace. Common sense would probably tell some people that this is creepy and ethically wrong. Yet humans have long thought to keep the dead in the world of the living through media. First, it was portrait and sculpture, then photography, then video. So it's not necessarily unnatural that the next stop in media would be the desire to recreate the deceded through VR, which allows for interaction. This setting was unrealistic when I first started serializing my novels in newspapers. But later, Korean and Chinese companies actually released products that closely resembled them, and readers' perceptions changed. On the other hand, it was words that taught me about my father. When I was a child, I used to ask my mother endlessly, what was my father like? Not only that, I also asked her many times, why did my father die? But it was not always in a serious tone. I grew up in a family where it was normal for my father to be absent for as long as I can remember. And my grandparents and other relatives were very sympathetic and kind to me. I never felt lonely or sad because of my father's absence. Whenever I asked my mother a question about my father, she never tired of telling me about his appearance, personality, and happy episodes until I was satisfied. I would ask her to tell me the same story over and over again. She also tried her best to answer the difficult philosophical question of why my father had to die so suddenly at such a young age, a question that had no answer. Now that I think about it, I see this image of my mother overlapping with the attitude of a novelist trying to tell the reader about the protagonist. Just as I wanted to know about my father but didn't know him, so the reader tries to know without knowing anything about the protagonist. So as a novelist, just as my mother did with me, I tell the reader step by step what the protagonist looks like, what his personality is like, and what episodes he has. In the process, I will encounter abstract questions about death and life, but I must persist in telling them. The most striking thing about my mother's talk about my father was that it was always full of love. Some novelists, from a very high point of view, claim that literature is self-expression and that thinking about the reader is a kind of compromise and impure. However, I have the great experience of knowing my father through my mother's words, and I cannot deny that my mother was very considerate when she spoke to me. Therefore, when I write a novel, I'm always aware of my readers. But this has nothing to do with compromise in the commercial sense. Another way my father's death affected me was that the way he died. My father was a perfectly healthy man and was even the captain of the judo team in the university until one day his heart suddenly stopped. It was very strange for me. I then vaguely began to think that humans face two kinds of death. One is death that comes slowly over a period of 80 or 90 years. The other is a sudden death that comes one day, whether by accident, natural disaster, murder, or like my father, illness. I thought we are all bound to die in one of these two ways. And for me, still a child, death 80 years away seemed too far away to be frightening. But sudden death gave me an uncanny sense of dread. My heart is beating just like yours now. But if for some reason, as in the case of my father, the next beat doesn't sound right, that is where life will end. As I said at the beginning, I was an ordinary boy, but after I became aware of this, I suddenly began to experience strong anxiety when playing video games or reading comic books with my friends. I was afraid that my heart would stop beating one moment and I would die the next. And then I wondered, is it really okay for me to read comic books or play video games when I might die? Shouldn't I find something more, something I really want to do? Today, I respect very much authors of comic books and video game creators, but in my childhood, they weren't something that fascinated me exceptionally. But when I started to think about what exactly I wanted to do, I had no idea. In order to find out, I felt that I first had to know my true self, but I had no idea what that was, and I was completely lost. It was around this time that I began to read literature. I had no trouble in my elementary school life, but from the time I started thinking like this, I began to feel increasingly alienated in the classroom, in the middle school. I was basically a sociable person and had many friends, but I no longer find it very interesting to sit with my friends and talk about the TV show we watched yesterday or the comic books that came out this week. On the surface, however, I acted as if I enjoyed it. I'm sure that many people experience this kind of thing to a greater or lesser extent during their teenage years as their ego becomes established. But at that time, I didn't discuss it with my friends, and I felt that it was something unique to me. It was at that time that I somehow read and was shocked by Yukio Mishima's Kinkakuji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is a monologue novel about a young man who is unable to communicate with others because of his stutter, and whose only source of inspiration is the beauty of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. Ultimately, he burns down the Golden Pavilion in order to live in the real world. The confession of the protagonist is very dark, but the style of the novel is so glorious, poetic, and full of brilliant rhetoric that I was strongly drawn to the contrast between the young man's loneliness and his aesthetic expression. From that point, I continued to read Mishima's works as well as many of his literary influences, and began my journey as a reader of literature, including Thomas Mann, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and other poets of French symbolist school who wrote aesthetically about the division between the real and the ideal. When I read literary works, I sometimes come across a passage that surprised me. How can this author understand my mind so well? How could a German writer of the early 20th century know my mind in a way that my local friends in the Kyushu would not understand if I told them? Such an impression was so intense that it was in stark contrast to my school self, who was only superficially in tune with my friends. Gradually, I came to believe that the person I was at school was not my real self, that I was merely putting on the mask and acting, and that the person I was at home, immersed in literary works, was my real self. In other words, there was a big division within me. But then, like the protagonist in the pavilion of in the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, the real world for me became a nihilistic world lived with a mask. I began to worry about that. Concerns about what is the true self, what is individuality, were also part of the background of those times. Around the time I became a junior high school student, the Japanese Ministry of Education began to clearly state the goal of individuality-oriented education. And in the field of education, there was much talk about valuing individuality. Also, in the world of movies, TV dramas, and mangas, the most attractive characters were those who made the most of their individuality and lived their lives in their own way. A prominent example of this is athlete. They found what they want to do when they were young, worked hard to realize their dreams, and achieved success by competing in the Olympics or becoming first professional baseball players like Ichiro Suzuki. And these heroic stories become very popular. I also admire this way of life. However, Japanese junior high schools at that time were actually very uniform in education. So there was no opportunity for students to show their individuality. The result is an overemphasis on communication skills. Female writers of my generation often address in their works the anxiety of middle school and high school about who they would eat lunch with and whether or not they would be isolated and alone during the lunchtime. Because I was a fast lunch eater, I never had any serious concerns like that, but I can understand it. Later, many students, including myself, came to realize that living one's life to the fullest means doing what one wants to do. In other words, finding a job that is consistent with one's true self. This is a concept similar to Maslow's 5 stages of needs, in which one determines one's own individuality and achieves self-actualization through employment. In Japan, in particular, there has long been a system of lifetime employment, and it was common for a person who started working for a company in his 20s to stay in the same job for 40 years until he retires in his 60s. This was even more true for professions such as doctors and teachers. Thus, the profession became central to a person's identity, which is why conformity to one's true self was so important. However, I still had no idea what I wanted to do in the future. In Japan, high school students who major in the natural sciences generally have a concrete idea of what they want to do by the time they take the university entrance exam, such as an architecture for engineering students or astrophysics for science students. On the other hand, students who plan to study social sciences or humanities are very vague. I loved literature and felt that I was the real me when I read books, and I started writing novels in high school. But as a high school student in a rural area, I had no realistic idea that I would or could become a novelist. What would I do in the real world? I couldn't even think about that. I didn't want it to stay in my hometown of Kitakyushu. On the other hand, Japan's bubble economy was at its peak and then collapsing. And I was deeply disgusted by Tokyo's frivolous frenzy and decline. As I mentioned earlier, I liked Thomas Mann and sympathized with his protagonist who vacillated between civil society and art. But in Japan, there is a kind of hollow civil society. And when one falls into an identity crisis, instead of seeking a place of belonging in the local community, there are two extreme choices: to suddenly assimilate into ruthless capitalism, like the people in the bubble economy, or to jump into the nationalism and become a nationalist like Yukio Mishima in his late days. But I was not interested in either. I ended up studying law at Kyoto University. It was a decision I made in an ambiguous state, neither in Kitakyushu nor in Tokyo, and I also had no idea what I wanted to become. Looking back on those days, I still feel pain in my heart, because although I was an unreliable student, my desire and impatience to do and be something was so great that it made me writhe. I entered university in 1994 at a time when the bubble economy had burst and Japan's post-war economic development had finally come to an end. Politically, the end of the Cold War destroyed the simple image of the world as divided into East and West. And unrealistic and frightening events such as the Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake and the Om Shinrikyo, a cult, subway sarin gas attack continued to take place. Meanwhile, the internet had just been born, and there was no way out of the confusion and the sense of stagnation. In the 90s. Our parents' generation, however, was the generation that truly realized post-war economic development and was brimming with self-confidence. Our generation was condemned as pitiful and pathetic young people who didn't know what to do in the future, who had no dreams and no hopes. But of course, this was not a problem unique to our generation. Soseki Natsume, one of Japan's leading novelists of the Meiji era, late 19th to early 20th century, had almost exactly the same problem as we did. In the lecture entitled My Individualism, he recalled his youth as follows. I had to do something since I, quote, I had to do something since I was born into this world, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. I cowered like a lonely man caught in a fog. I'll finish quoting. Soseki was born in the pre-modern feudal society of the Edo period. At that time, Japan had a class system with occupations defined by family status: samurai, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Although modern historiography points out that there was a certain amount of fluidity between the various occupations, there was basically no freedom of choice of occupation. But conversely, we can say there was no need to spend one's teenage years wondering what one's true self was and finding an occupation that suited one's personality. Children of warriors were warriors, children of merchants were merchants, and family background was the center of identity. However, as modernization brought technological innovation, urban population growth, and the emergence of new industries, there was no choice but to liberalize occupational choice in order to provide an efficient supply of young workers to meet the demands of society. A simple fixed status system would not suffice. New industries that society needs are vibrant and pay well, so they naturally attract young people. industries that are no longer needed will lose people. As a result, the ideal society in which occupational choice is liberalized automatically allocates labor to the right people for the right jobs. In reality, this does not always work, but there is no other way. Anyway, an individual's identity has shifted from family background to occupation. For the individual, the freedom to choose one's profession should be a blessing. But in reality, as I just mentioned, it's also an obligation that society imposes on young people to choose their profession. This is because if young people don't quickly determine their aptitudes and begin to work in the necessary fields, society will soon become dysfunctional. This is why young people feel that society is pressuring them to fulfill their obligation as soon as possible, although they were supposed to enjoy the right of the freedom of choice in the form of freedom of occupation. And they have to ask themselves what their true self is. People of our generation, after a bend in the road, finally determine their own individuality and try to enter the workforce after graduating from the university and college. It's a unique system in Japan that companies hire students en masse after they graduate from the university and college. And at the time when the lifetime employment system was firmly in place, changing jobs and mid-career hiring were not easy, and looking for a job after graduation was a major turning point in one's life. However, the severe recession that followed the burst of the bubble economy caused companies to limit their hiring of new graduates, resulting in the employment ice age, a period of job hunting difficulties. Basically, Dankai Junior generation, the baby boomer generation, had a large population. And during this period, the Ministry of Education established a large number of new colleges. And the college enrollment rate was also very high. Thus, a large number of college graduates were competing for the few jobs available. What happened as a result? Our generation, which had been educated so much about the importance of the individuality and encouraged to realize our true selves socially through our professions, could not find jobs, and many of us fell into a serious identity crisis. What am I to this society? Moreover, if the entire generation had failed to find works, there would have been a kind of intergenerational solidarity. But this was not the case. And there were differences even within the same generation, depending on educational background, of course. Those who graduate from good universities were able to enter the companies of their choice and became full-time employees. But a large number of irregular workers and needs were also born. By the time they were in their 20s, even full-time workers were not earning much, while casual workers could earn a decent income if they were physically strong and could increase their workload. So the inequality within the generation and within this generation and between generations were not fully apparent at first. But with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, a large number of casual workers lost their jobs. And while the reality is that even those in their 30s and 40s are still stuck in low-wage manual jobs, those who were hired as regular workers were promoted within their companies, received higher salaries, got married, and led stable lives. Despite the differences, however, this generation was generally characterized by more precarious employment than the generations before and after it, and eventually came to be known as the lost generation, lost gene. Japan is facing a rapidly aging society with a low birth rate, and one of the reasons for this is that the lost generation was unable to marry and have children due to poverty. They have little savings, and there are fears in the society that Japan's social security system will fail as this generation ages. Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, the most internationally acclaimed novel by a Japanese author of this generation, cannot be fully understood without this background. The recognition of others as useful happily satisfied our need for approval when it comes from someone close to us. We enjoy being useful to our friends and loved people. But when it comes to the state or capitalism, there is a danger that usefulness can easily turn into a denial of individualism and exploitation by corporations. This has been often seen in Japan for the last 30 years. The poverty of the lost generation, lost gene, was caused by sheer bad luck in the terms of population size and difficulty of finding work after the bursting of the bubble economy. But the adherents of neoliberalism, in opposition to those who criticize the widening gap between rich and poor, dismiss it as self-responsibility. The rich succeeded through hard work in the harsh, competitive capitalist society, while the poor were lazy and lacked effort. The fallacy of this explanation is discussed in detail in Professor Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good, which has recently become a hot topic in Japan. It's a complete deception to say that this is the result of individual free competition. The gap between rich and poor is reproduced generation after generation. Japan still has a large gender gap, and the wage gap between men and women is widening. But the self-responsibility, the notion of self-responsibility hides such discrimination. However, this belief in meritocracy also has a long history in Japan. The Meiji Restoration, a revolutionary movement that modernized Japan, was led by low-ranked samurai, and so during the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, the idea of success in life through hard work was praised and systematically promoted with the introducing of examination system. Meritocracy, above all, was crucial to the rejection of the status system of the feudal era. Yukichi Fukuzawa, an Enlightenment thinker of the Meiji period, and long the portrait on the 10,000 yen bill, wrote in his 1872 bestseller, Gakumon no Susume, Encouragement of Learning, which was read by 1 in 10 Japanese at that time. Quote, people are born without distinction of birth, low or rich. Those who study and know things well become rich and noble, while those who are uneducated become poor and lowly. Quote end. One of the most popular European thinkers of the time was Spencer, and social Darwinism was also imported into Japan very early in its modernization. On the other hand, the advent of the internet, the collapse of the lifetime employment system, and the promotion of job mobility and dual employment have have changed the relation between one's single true self and one's occupation, which used to be closely linked, and have diversified the recipients of one's identity in the society. In Idleborn, Rin Usami, winner of the 2021 Akutagawa Prize, a young woman devotes her entire identity to the fun activities of an idol singer. Today, it's not uncommon to find examples of individualities who support their social identity both in terms of income and recognition of existence through activities on YouTube and TikTok in addition to their day jobs. It's a new place of belonging, neither to capitalism nor the state. I'm talking about generational differences based on economic status, but this doesn't directly translate into the characteristics of each generation of writers. It seems that the motivation for each generation of writers to become involved in literature and to begin creative works is a kind of social maladjustment. This is also true for writers of the bubble generation and for writers in their 20s today. But I believe that the differences between each generation are still evident in how they were isolated from society and what they rebelled against or sympathized with in their contemporaries. Although I myself didn't end up working for a company and began my career as a novelist in Kyoto University, I am very aware that I belong to the lost generation, lost gene. The difficulty of finding work has been experienced by my close friends, and I have first-hand experience with society's wariness of this generation's aging future. Therefore, I'm a strong anti-self-responsibility theorist. So in my novels, I don't leave the story too much to the character traits of the characters, but carefully describe the social context. Otherwise, even the happiness or unhappiness of the characters in my novels would be self-responsible. The gap between the rich and the poor is a problem of the social structure and the times. I don't want to deny the virtue of individual effort, but it's not everything. On the other hand, of course, what am I must also be considered ontologically from the side of communication. I have already emphasized that my generation has condemned to be who we are and to live our lives in an individualistic way. But at the same time, we have been expected to have communication skills. At first glance, these two challenges seem contradictory, for in order to appreciate the diversity of society and communicate successfully with others of different backgrounds and personalities, we must be diverse ourselves. A rigid I am me wherever I go attitude won't allow for successful communication, or we will live a personality like a mass product that works for everyone. Personality is a kind of pattern that emerges as a result of interactional communication with others. However, the differentiation of personality for each interpersonal relationship seems to contradict the idea of a unique true self. Therefore, as a last resort, a model has been devised in which the true self is one, but there are multiple social personas or roles, and one lives one's life using each of them differently. As a novelist, I had made it a theme of my work to deal with this issue. Let me talk a little about it at the end. I focus on the concept of individual. Individual was translated as kojin in Japanese, but historically, there was no such concept in Japan. It was not until the Meiji period, when European ideas were imported on a large scale, that the term kojin, individual, became a commonplace. It should be obvious to English speakers that the word individual is a combination of the negative prefix in and the word divide. But it's almost impossible to read the meaning cannot be divided from the Japanese translation, kojin. The word individual comes from the 6th century Latin word individus, which was originally used to translate the Greek word atomos. Individus literally means that which cannot be divided. How it came to mean one person is not explained today, but according to a brief explanation in Raymond Williams' Keyword Dictionary, it was the influence of Christianity and a monotheistic religion, as well as logic and biology. In dismantling the hierarchically differentiated feudal system and redesigning a functionally differentiated modern civic and capitalist society. Europe, since modern times, had made the individual with its essential unity, which cannot be further divided, its fundamental unit. Property was based on the idea of individual self-ownership, and it was the individual who was given basic human rights, the right to vote, and was the subject of his contract as a worker in the functionally differentiated system of production and distribution. Japan imported this concept of the individual as the subject of legal rights and the subject of contracts for economic activities as it modernized. However, in everyday human communication, as I mentioned earlier, we are inevitably forced to differentiate into different personalities for different people. We cannot maintain an undivided subject. You live different personalities when you are with your boss at work, with your casual friends, with your lover, or with your parents. For example, when we read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Anna's differentiated personalities are very skillfully depicted in different interpersonal relationships. In the presence of her husband, Karenin, in the presence of her lover, Blonsky, in the presence of her children, and in the presence of her brother, Oblonsky. Also, in the novels of Balzac and Stendhal, stories of young men who came to the capital from the countryside with dreams of success in the modern centralized society are a staple of modern literature. And as in Soseki's Sanshiro, the division between the personality of one's hometown and the personality created to adapt to the metropolis is thematized. In the dimension of the legal system, human beings are considered to be indivisible entities. But in the everyday social sphere, they must inevitably have several faces. Thus, the Jungian model is adopted, in which that true self is one, but in the social sphere, several superficial personas are used. While this idea is deeply rooted today, it has several drawbacks. One is that when we communicate with others, we cannot always distinguish personas from the ego and manipulate or use them superficially. Our interpersonal interactions are always accompanied by emotional changes such as joy, anger, sadness, and physiological reactions, so we cannot control our reactions such as laughing, crying, or even sweating or having a loud heartbeat. If we take all social selves to be somehow performative, then the real self would be an abstract entity cut off from all social relationships, which is contrary to the fundamental fact that we are animals with social lives. Moreover, even when we are alone, our personalities differ greatly depending on the type of environment in which we find ourselves. If we are homeless and camping out in the cold, or if you are drinking champagne alone in the luxury hotel suite, there must be a comprehensive change in your personality from the way you think to the way you feel. Personalities change relatively according to the two variables of interpersonal relationships and the external environment. And a model that posits a fixed personality without either of these as the true self is inappropriate. So I developed a model in which all of the differentiated personalities are the true selves. I named each of these differentiated personalities dividual as opposed to individual, and assigned the word bunjin as the Japanese translation. The individuals don't exist in the same proportion within oneself. If you were to visualize this by drawing something like a pie chart, you would think of the individual that is important to you with someone you like as being in large proportions, and the other individual for someone seeing only once every few years as being in relatively small portions. Who do you associate with? What kind of environment do you live in? And what is the composition and proportion of the people in your life? Being able to decide this is both a freedom and a responsibility of human beings. The notion of the individual emphasizes the coherence of the ego, which cannot be internally divided. But on the other hand, it means that others and oneself can be clearly divided from each other. In reality, however, we are constantly influenced by the external environment, are open to others, continue to be influenced by them, continue to be mixed with them, and continue to influence them. Thus, in the concept of individual, we are internally divided, but we are rather in the state of having installed a circuit of communication with others that cannot be divided. It is important to note that the subject cannot be simplified and purified, as various influences from different environments and others continue to mix within oneself at all times. An advantage of this idea is that, as mentioned earlier, it's flexible to the diversity of society. I also believe it's effective in overcoming social divisions. Economist Amartya Sen says that the illusion of a single standard of identity serves the violent ends of those who orchestrate conflict and is skillfully promoted and nurtured by those who orchestrate killing and carnage, and that there is a need to recognize the plurality of identities, and identity must not be somehow found, but rather we must decide as responsible human beings which of our multiple relationships and affiliation we will prioritize. Sorry. Our society through the indivisible subject model of the individual, attempts to link an unitary entity into a single point of belonging: Christian, Muslim, black, white, Republican, Democrat, teacher, lower, etc. In then struggles to find greater value in integrating the resulting divisions between social groups. Instead, Sen argues we should focus on the multiple identities that each person possesses and rather overcome division through a network of fragmented relationships. Though his thought on the plural identities isn't completely the same with my idea, individualism, I agree with his view. You might be a Democrat supporter, but at the same time, you might be a Christian, a cisgender lesbian, a jazz fan, or raising 2 children. Then through something of those multiple identities, it may be possible to open a circuit of communication even with supporters of opposing political parties. In an increasingly unstable and uncertain society, I believe it's important to view the self as a multiple project, a situation where one income or relation fails, but another source of income or relationship is maintained, should dynamically stabilize our lives. It's also extraordinarily important to note that by setting the object of self-knowledge not as a single individual self, but as multiple individuals in each interpersonal relationship, self-negation and self-affirmation can be seen as partial negation and partial affirmation for each individual, rather than as a total affirmation and a total negation. Especially in Japan, teenage suicide has been a serious social problem. If you can observe your liked and disliked individual relatively, you can prevent yourself from committing total negative suicide. On the other hand, self-affirmation is not narcissism, but gratitude for the existence of someone who creates your liked individual is a prerequisite for self-affirmation. By my definition, love is loving someone and at the same time being able to be who you like, thanks to that person. I'd like to discuss this further, but unfortunately I don't have the time. If you are interested, please visit the website for an explanation of the individuals and in the handout. I had made a 7-minute video in English. I have rambled on, but I'd like to conclude my presentation. I'm sure there are many points that are unclear and unsatisfactory, so please don't hesitate to discuss them during the following question and answer time. Thank you very much.